This conference will now be recorded.
And we are recording now. Okay. So thank you and welcome everybody. Azadeh?
Morning, everybody. My name is Azadeh Tavakoli. I am the treasurer for NAHARA. Longtime fan of Rick McGee and coming to watch his sessions and in sessions across Indian country, and learning from you is a great honor. So thank you for joining us today, Rick. And I hope you guys enjoy the session.
We have Dorothy with us.
Good morning. I'm Dorothy Sear. I'm a board member with the National Native American Human Resources Association. And just want to say thank you, Rick, for taking the time. I'm interested in this topic, and I'm sure as everyone else is. So I'm looking forward to the information. And just welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're here and took the time to join us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. And we have Mike.
Good morning, everybody. You know, one of the most important things is make sure you have your coffee in your coffee cup today. So, Rick, it's great to see you. You know, I love seeing that number, 40 people signed up just to show you how much, how important this topic is. So excited to sit back and learn some stuff. So
Great. And do we have Tal?
Hi, everybody. Yes. Hi, Janet, Judy. Thanks for the intro. Just real quick. I also want to recognize Tony Chartrand. Tony is an advisor for the board, and his advising capacity is with education and THRP, our tribal human resource professionals. So Tony, thanks for being with us. And I echo what everyone else has said. Rick, welcome. Great topic. I'm not going to say anything else because there's lots to hear, and I think we'll probably have a lot of interaction as we go through this morning. So Rick, thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you. Rick, floor is all yours.
Janet, thank you very much. And Janet, thank you for your work for making this happen. And I've got low computer skills, and Janet's been very, very helpful in making sure that I'm able to participate today. Judy and the board, thank you very much for the warm welcome and the opportunity. Tal, Tony, et cetera, and then especially all of our participants, our NAHARA members. I want to build on Tal's word, interaction. Would love to have a conversation with you because this is a casual conversation. I've got my cup of coffee. I'm just going to show you the evidence of it here. No fancy cup, but I'm looking forward to a casual conversation with you. And in planning for today's session, we have set aside time to not only navigate your questions in the chat box during the presentation portion, but we have plenty of time to get the benefit of your advice, your practical experience, and then I'm happy to weigh in on some of those legal issues to the extent that that might be helpful. Let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today, and happy to share, Janet and I can share the PowerPoint as well with you. But to the extent that we're talking about vaccines, there's a lot of conversation right now about whether they are going to be legally required. And is that a legal requirement from the tribe itself as an exercise of our inherent sovereignty? Or what's going to be the impact of President Biden's promise that we're going to have an emergency rule from OSHA? How does OSHA impact us as tribal organizations? Secondly, exemptions. Should we account for folks that have a religious exemption or a disability-based, an immunity-based exemption? So we want to spend a little bit of time with that. And we're going to spend a little extra time with the religious exemption based on conversation with Tal. And I agree with Tal. This religious thing seems to be hard to get our hands around sometimes. And we have a couple respectful recommendations there. Judy, I think Judy talked a little bit about confidentiality, Judy and Janet, prior to coming into today's call. So we want to make sure that if we are collecting information, we're being respectful of our employees' privacy. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, we all as employers, I should say you all as employers, have been very creative over the last 2 years in making sure that we can meet all of the needs of our tribal organizations. And we can talk a little bit about that as reasonable accommodations. What can we do to make an exception to the policy? Maybe a vaccine policy. Can we create some circumstances where people can continue to contribute as employees, but might not be physically in the workplace? Next, what happens? What are some of the consequences? Can an employee be disciplined for not being at work? What about being terminated? Is that a possibility? And the answer is yes. But are there some exceptions to that? We'll talk a little bit about job protected leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act, and then our discretionary policies, vacation, sick, etc. And then I want to spend a little bit of time on telecommuting. I think that there are a couple issues that we should be thinking about that you've probably already thought about. But to the extent that employees continue to telecommute, I've got about 3 minutes on that if time allows. So that's a little bit on our agenda, but probably the most important agenda item there is, what do you want to discuss? And again, Janet and I have, and the board have set aside some time to the extent that there are questions from folks on the call. A little bit of information about me, a little bit of contact information. Moving on then, let's talk about mandated vaccines from the employer. And instead of going to President Biden, and President Biden's gotten a lot of press over the last 3 weeks when he came out and announced the emergency OSHA rule. But let's talk about the tribe itself. There are 3 sovereigns, as we know: tribal, state, federal. As a tribe, can we, from a policy perspective, or maybe from a law perspective, can tribal council promulgate a resolution that says all of our employees will be vaccinated or won't be vaccinated? And the answer is yes. So we always start from that premise. We always start from tribal sovereignty. And so when it comes to the tribe, can the tribe define these rules? And the answer is yes. And some tribes are, whether through a tribal resolution or through a policy. There are some tribes that are mandating the vaccine. What are some of the factors that tribes are considering? And it seems to me that on that list of 4, the 4th item is driving most of the conversation, which is, what happens when we require those employees that have not been vaccinated voluntarily? What happens when we put pressure on them? We're seeing in the NBA, Kyrie Irving out there with the Nets, and we had somebody with the Golden State Warriors, Mr. Wiggins. There was some pressure on employees to be vaccinated for a range of reasons, and the conversation really is focused on what happens when employees leave. And we're seeing some, United Airlines has lost some employees, and some other big employers have. So this is a real issue here. Before the call started today, Tal mentioned civil rights. And is there a civil right to not have the government tell us what to do? Can we make our own medical decisions? And I think that there is a good faith conversation there when it comes to employees expressing themselves and expressing their desire on whether to be vaccinated or not. In visiting with tribal leaders, including tribal councils, this has been a big part of the conversation in my practice, in having these conversations with tribal councils and leaders of tribal gaming enterprises, et cetera, on the potential loss of employees. In addition to that, there are some other factors that we should think about, because not all, there is no tribe that is the same as another tribe, and as employers, we are different as well. What impact has the virus had on the tribe up until now? And speaking about Indian country generally, it's had a devastating impact on a number of tribes, and that's a real motivator in not only protecting our employees, but our communities, our citizens, and our members. How many employees do you have? Because a more complex organization, if you've got 2,000 employees, that's a more complex organization than 200 employees. Both are complex, but if you had a smaller number of employees, let's say you had a 15-person office, well, maybe there are some things you can do in a 15-person office that you can't do with a 2,000 person office. So we need to think about the specific circumstances. The third item there talks about workplace size and density. So I think we should consider some of those factors in evaluating whether we should mandate this or not, or continue, as some of our tribal employers have, with some generous incentive programs. Those big screen, I don't want to make light of this, but I have a client that is giving away big screen TVs if you get vaccinated. That's a pretty powerful incentive, right? When it comes to gift cards and TVs and other things. So are there some ways that we can persuade folks to be vaccinated if that's what we want to do? So are there some alternatives? So think about those factors, and I'd be interested to hear from you all if there are other factors that I have not spoke to here this morning. Next, if we do mandate the vaccine, whether it's through tribal law or policy, should we administer the vaccine? And I don't have any strong legal opinion on this, but the reading that I've been doing, the lawyers that seem to have the no on this seem to say don't do it as an employer. There are some efficiencies when you bring a team of folks into your tribal casino and you vaccinate your employees, but there are additional risks from a liability standpoint when you are both mandating the vaccine and administering the vaccine. And from a record keeping standpoint, that might not be something you want to do. And we're going to talk about record keeping in a little bit. To the extent that our own IHS clinic or tribal clinic is offering the vaccine, I don't see any liability issues that are enhanced when we mandate the vaccine as a tribal employer, because those clinics are set up to do just that, which is to offer medical medical opportunities or medical giving the vaccine itself, the shot. But I don't know that employers should be in the business of engaging in medical things. Let's talk a little bit about President Biden and his declaration 2 or 3 weeks ago that if you were an employer larger than 100 employees, and he didn't tell us how he's going to count that. Is he going to count just employees that are physically present or employees that are also on the payroll but at home? I've been told the speculation is it doesn't matter whether the employees are at home or not. If they're on your payroll, that counts towards the 100, but that's speculation. So what's the impact on this rule that OSHA is going to issue probably in the next week, I've been told? So let's talk a little bit about the law here. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act is a federal law, and there are state equivalents of this, and some tribes have TOSHAs as well. So the OSHA is a law of general applicability. Remember our question and answer on do federal employment laws apply? And the answer is yes, no, and maybe. And how's that for a really clear answer? Not very clear at all. But OSHA is in the maybe category. There is an argument it applies. There's an argument it does not apply. Unlike Title VII, which specifically addresses tribes and says it does not apply to tribes, OSHA doesn't say anything. So it's a law of general applicability, meaning it applies to all employers, but there is some case law that says, wait a minute, to the extent that it applies to Target and Walmart, it might not apply to tribal employers, which are sovereign. So there is an argument here. Some of the factors there, depending on where you are in the country, different courts have interpreted this confusing area of the law differently. So, and in addition to that, depending on what you do, Judy Wright, as the vice president of HR in her casino, she's got to look at this and say, there's a pretty decent argument that OSHA might apply to my casino, but when I travel over to the tribal government at San Pasqual, there's a better argument it does not apply. So if you are engaged in a commercial activity, some of the courts have said that it's more likely that the argument that OSHA applies is going to be a winning strategy. So I wish I could give you clarity on this. I can't, but there's an argument OSHA applies, an argument that it does not. So whether this is a tribal law, a tribal policy, or a reaction to OSHA, the analysis is still the same. Whether we are going to mandate or not, and then if we do mandate, what does that policy look like? Let's talk a little bit about exemptions, because if we require our employees, we've moved on beyond incentives, beyond giving gift cards or other incentives for an employee to take the vaccine. If we do require it, or in other words, we mandate it, what does that look like? So there are some model policies out there. As NAHARA, I have one. I'd be happy to share a model policy on this. But my model policy has modeled what folks are doing in reaction to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, you're raising your hand and saying the ADA does not apply to us, and you're right again. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, generally does not apply to tribal employers, but we're using it as a model, so it doesn't control the conversation, but it influences it from a best practices standpoint. If we do let that influence us, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does not have jurisdiction over us. The ADA does not apply to us, but looking again from a best practices standpoint, the EEOC has said, give some thought to exemptions or exceptions to the mandate for disability, pregnancy, and religion. So disability is pretty straightforward. Maybe not an application, but if there's medical evidence of an immune compromised employee, for example, there's medical evidence that the vaccine will do more harm than good for that particular employee, then there is a good faith disability exemption. We should have a conversation with that employee, and our policy should give that employee an opportunity to raise their hand and say, hey, I've got a disability. I want to have a private conversation with the good people in human resources. I want to fill out this form and ask you for this exemption, this exception to the mandate. And then we're going to get to how we react to that in a moment. We're going to talk about that as a reasonable accommodation, but disability should be one. Pregnancy is a little more tricky. At the beginning of the conversation 18 months ago, there was kind of this automatic idea that when it came to pregnant women, and as a man, I'm kind of out of my league, right? I don't know that I need to be speaking about pregnant women at this point. However, there was early in the conversation, it seemed from a pregnancy standpoint, maybe not. Maybe the vaccine's not a good idea, but I was reading an article today and I'm looking at my notes now, 1/3 of pregnant women between the ages of 18 and 49 are fully vaccinated as of October 9. I'll say that one more time. 1/3 of pregnant women between the ages of 18 and 49 years of age are fully vaccinated as of October 9. Almost 70% of the general population, 18 years and older, are vaccinated. So there's a real gap there between pregnant women that are vaccinated and the general population. But there are a number of women that are being vaccinated even though they are pregnant. I was looking at the CDC website, and the CDC does recommend, unless there are other factors, does recommend that pregnant women become vaccinated. So this is less clear to me on whether pregnancy should be an exemption, and I think that as an HR team, along with your legal advisors, give that some thought. Finally, should religion be an exception to the mandate? And the EEOC, which does not have jurisdiction over us, says that it should. And let's talk a little bit about this religious mandate. We move on to the next slide. So when you look at the EEOC guidances, it makes a number of really common sense suggestions. First of all, religion's not limited to the big three: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So to the extent that someone practices a religion that might not be accepted by a majority of the folks in your community, it does not matter under that EEOC guidance. And then to make this more confusing, at least to me, it's not the specific doctrines that are accepted within Catholicism, for example. It's the employee's interpretation of those doctrines. And we've seen some examples where, again, citing the Catholic Church, there have been bishops and cardinals that have taken different positions on the same question of whether a vaccine's appropriate or not. So again, there's a lot of confusion here. But let's make this practical a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do to evaluate whether a religious exemption is in good faith. Let's check out those suggestions at the bottom of the page. First of all, know your employees, kind of that casino thing, know your customer, know your employees. And this might not just be our HR folks, this is those directors and managers. And engage your employee in a conversation. And to the extent that a supervisor knows that Rick is not a Jewish person, well, he's never claimed to be a Jewish person until now, and now he is. And he's never been to synagogue in his life. And his parents aren't Jewish, right? So to the extent that I am making a claim for something that everyone knows I'm not, well, we can talk to our employees about that. One of the techniques that is suggested is ask your employees to provide a narrative. But there's a little bit of a caution here. If you ask them to do it on paper, not all of our employees are really good on paper. So sit down and talk to them. What is it about your religious beliefs that lead you to believe that a vaccine's not appropriate? And if the employee, going back to the middle of the slide here, if the employee, instead of talking about religion, spends more time talking about Big Brother, or the government can't control me, or they've rushed the vaccine to market too quickly, I don't trust, big pharmaceutical companies. If the conversation's more focused on those things, those are not religious, that's not a religious basis for this. So talk to your employees, get them to justify things. I'm also told, I haven't seen these, but I understand that the internet is full of form letters that employees have used to justify these religious-based exemptions. And a form letter may articulate what the employee believes, but be careful in accepting those without that conversation. If the employee, we're looking at steps 1 and 2, if the employee's narrative, whether on paper or in a conversation or from reports from their director or manager or supervisor, if it appears to be a sincerely held religious belief, then we would move on to reasonable accommodation. If not, then deny the request. You can deny these requests, but every article I've read on this, and it's been probably 3 or 4, each of the authors says, be careful. Err on the side of giving the religious exemption if in doubt. So those 50-50 cases on the close calls provide the exemption. Regardless of what you do, whether you honor the exemption or not, documentation, and I'm speaking to the choir here, HR people are all about documentation. So let's move on and talk a little bit about confidentiality, and I'm going to be very brief here. I recommend that when you gather medical information here, do it the same way you do under the FMLA. And we know under the FMLA that our directors and managers can't have medical information, right? All that medical information has to be in human resources in a confidential file. And I'm not saying the Family and Medical Leave Act applies to tribes, just like some other laws. It's a maybe, just like OSHA, it's a maybe, but in following that best practice, let's maintain the confidentiality of this medical information out of respect for our employees' confidentiality and for potential liability purposes. And then our healthcare clinics, in addition to that, as Janet talked about during our planning conversation, HIPAA. Our healthcare providers are going to be very concerned from a HIPAA standpoint as well. Let's talk a little bit about those reasonable accommodations. So Rick has asked for a disability accommodation or a religious accommodation. You've granted that to me. So what are we going to do now? Can we still keep Rick in the workforce, keep him engaged, keep him working? but create another way of making that happen. And let's talk a little bit about that under this umbrella of the reasonable accommodation or the reasonable exception. So first of all, President Biden has said that when it comes to the vaccine mandate, testing might be an alternative to protect ourselves. So Rick continues to come to work, but he gets tested every single Monday morning or Friday afternoon, whatever it is, just to make sure that we are continuing to evaluate whether he is, he has COVID or not. And we know with our asymptomatic cases, he might not show evidence of any COVID from a symptom standpoint. So testing might be an alternative. I'll come back to the ADA, the second line there. How often President Biden has said it's likely to be at least weekly. I know there's a federal policy for federal contractors that has recently come out, and those are weekly tests. Who pays for the test? All the speculation I have seen, this cost is going to fall to the employer because the employer is perceived to have the deeper pocket than the employee, but we don't know yet because this OSHA emergency test is not out. When it comes to other reasonable accommodations, whether it's continuing to require masks and the type of mask, that's another thing that we can do to protect. We can have people continue to work from home from a telecommuting standpoint. And then in a smaller office, is there a way of isolating certain employees in their office or elsewhere in a smaller location where they're able to work and can continue to come to work without exposing our citizens, their colleagues, and patrons at a casino, etc. So I always say be as creative as you can. We talk about the interactive process. Again, we don't like to use these words, reasonable accommodation or interactive process, because these laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act that talks about these laws, this law does not apply to us, but you all know about the interactive process, so it's an easy way of referring to it. Talk to your employees. See if there is a creative solution here where they can continue to be on the payroll, continue to contribute while having a creative solution here. There is a morale issue here though, isn't there? To the extent that you let Rick continue to work from home because of his religious exemption, that's a private conversation that Judy, as my HR director, had with me. And the rest of employees don't know that I have a religious-based exemption. And as an HR team, Judy's not able to really communicate a lot of that on why I was able to stay at home and continue to telecommute while Tal and Janet had to come to work. So managing these expectations and managing some of these morale issues, that's a steeper hill than us lawyers have to tackle, and just giving a little bit of legal analysis. Finally, when it comes to engaging employees in the hiring context, again, the ADA does not apply, but before you have a medical conversation with an employee, with a candidate for employment, a conditional job offer is what Target and Walmart does before they engage in any medical information about a vaccine. Now, if an employee, and we're seeing this, you have all seen this as well, employees are placing this on their resumes. Employees can always volunteer this information, and that's not a problem. But when it comes to asking an employee, are you vaccinated? The better practice is after a conditional job offer is provided. What happens when employees miss work? And whether it's a quarantine or other thing, we start from your attendance policy, and that's the premise here. And if employees miss work for whatever reason, we can address that. That's the first answer. The second answer is, does the employee have a valid excuse? And that's probably primarily defined by your policy. and it might also be defined by some, not beyond your absence policy, it might be defined by some other things as well. So let's move on to that. So the answer is yes, an employee can be disciplined for missing work. An employee can be terminated for missing work. That's the premise of our conversation. What are some of the exceptions to that? Well, many of us have adopted the Family and Medical Leave Act, or at least the standard. We haven't adopted it outright, the federal law, but we have adopted that standard. And to the extent that an employee or an employee's family has a serious health condition, then that employee, if they're eligible, if they've been working for us a year and have worked 1,250 hours, and if they jump through certain hoops in asking for FMLA, then there might be some opportunity for leave, job protected leave there. And then on the discretionary side, tribes and tribal employers are very, very generous in providing vacation, sick, leave of absence, short-term and long-term disability. And those are really policy-driven conversations. I'm going to glance at my clock here to see how I'm doing. I think we're doing okay and Janet's giving me the thumbs up, which I very much appreciate. And then very briefly here, before we get to comments and questions, when it does come to telecommuting, just a couple quick reminders here. One thing that I recommend is making sure that we offer safe working environments. And that also means for our employees at home. I think it's probably a bridge too far to send your safety inspector to my home, to my bedroom office and inspect, whether my desk is at the right height or not. I'm not making that recommendation, but at least telling your employees that they should have a safe working environment at home. And if they need equipment at home, they need that chair with back support, et cetera, at least engage in that conversation. Next, when it comes to non-exempt employees, so again, the Fair Labor Standards Act may or may not apply to tribes, but we have non-exempt or overtime eligible employees. Even though they're working from home, we still have to pay them the same way as if they're working here at the tribal center or at the tribal gaming enterprise. It's easier to monitor our non-exempt or overtime eligible employees when they are physically located in our buildings. Not easy, but easier, right? Because they're punching in and punching out, et cetera. But non-exempt employees still get a 15-minute break in the morning. They still get their 30-minute or 60-minute lunch hour, and our policy should reinforce that. And if they are on the phone on Saturday night or Sunday morning or answering emails at 9 o'clock, our non-exempt employees get paid for all of the hours that they work, all of the minutes that they work. So take a look at your policies to make sure that it is crystal clear that employees get paid for all of the time that they work, especially for our non-exempt overtime eligible employees. There is a safe harbor provision included in the Fair Labor Standards Act regulations, and that safe harbor provision is focused on exempt employees, and it says, hey, exempt employees, if we've paid you incorrectly, tell us. Well, I'm a big believer in including non-exempts in that policy as well. All employees, if you notice a problem with your paycheck, tell us. And if you're right, we're going to fix it. I think that's a great policy. It's not great because I've said it, it's great because a number of you have implemented those policies, especially when employees are at home and they're somewhat out of our control when it comes to monitoring their time. So push that responsibility back on employees to make sure they are taking their breaks, they are accounting for their time, and they're telling us if we get the paycheck wrong. Finally, on this one, it's not really a legal issue as much as a best practice, but my HR colleagues have told me that when it comes to evaluating performance, it's a little different for employees at home because I don't see you every day. And so in addition to the job description or paying attention to policy, what projects, what special projects have Shirley and Sam worked on in the last 6 months. And make sure that our supervisors, our directors, our managers are focused on what employees are doing while they're at home. And it might be a slight departure from those job descriptions, but being aware of those kinds of things in evaluating employees that are at home, I think is consistent with best practices. Again, I so appreciate this privilege of having this conversation and all the time that I was able to devote to those slides. Janet, might be a good time for me to bounce the ball back to you if there are comments and questions from our board or our members. Thank you, Janet. Janet, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Rick. Lots of great information. To our members, if you have any questions, please use your chat box on the right-hand side. And I wanted to open the floor to our board members to ask them if they had any questions or any input.
Janet, I have a question for Rick. Going back to your conversation or your presentation about attendance and the attendance policy, there seems to be a pattern that we are recognizing with some of our team members. And what it is we give them the option, especially after an exposure and they're showing no symptoms, give them the option of testing after 3 to 5 days. Typically it's 5 days. Or they have to stay the maximum time off, which I believe is 14 days. So what we're finding is that on Friday, team members say that they've been exposed. They are they're forgoing the test, but wanting to stay out the maximum amount of time allowed by the CDC or required by the CDC. And so we see these patterns. So we've identified the patterns. But what we were speaking to on an operations side is as far as attendance, because we're on a point system, can we waive the points if they get tested and return back in a timely manner, or point them if they take the maximum time off? What are your thoughts on that?
Judy, thank you very much for that question. It's a really good question. So 2 answers to this. Answer number 1, we want to have a policy that protects our people. And the CDC guidances are a good measuring stick for making sure we are protecting our employees, our patrons, and our citizens. So as long as we are abiding by those standards from a policy standpoint, I think our liability is really, really low. Our legal risk is really, really low because we have a measuring stick to point to, and as you did in your question, the CDC standards. Mm-hmm. From there, the legal analysis really ends because your discretion as an employer to define your policies which best serve your organization is the answer. And to the extent that you are modifying your policy to deal with some of those employees that are cutting some corners, I like that because those are discretionary policies that you can modify. I hope that's responsive to your good question.
It answers my question, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question from Tal. Rick, what if a guest, spa for example, demands knowing if an employee is vaccinated? HIPAA protections?
So Tal, thank you very much for that question. And so the answer is I would not communicate any medical information about any specific employees. On the other hand, to the extent that we want to share our policy with the public on whatever that policy is, I don't see a downside on that. because we're not speaking about Janet, Tal, or Judy. We're not providing medical information. But to the extent that, you know, the NBA is saying all of our employees, including our players, are vaccinated. So they're communicating their general policy to offer assurance to the public to come to NBA games. I don't see any legal issues with that, but I certainly wouldn't say Judy, Tal, or Janet is either vaccinated or not. Whether based on HIPAA, and I'm more focused on HIPAA when it comes to our healthcare clinics. And then when it comes to confidentiality, that's normally a policy-driven thing from an employer perspective. From either perspective, I'd be very careful in sharing that medical information.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. That's very helpful. And it is letting people know that also in my readership that you can be vaccinated and still possibly a carrier. So to say they're vaccinated doesn't necessarily mean you're safe from COVID exposures. So it's just that complication. I like sharing the policy in general, and your answer is appreciated. Thank you.
That's a great point, Tal.
Dorothy, do you have any questions for Rick?
Well, I just have a comment in regards to, you know, in regards to leave for our employees. At the beginning of this, we allowed so many hours of COVID leave. And of course, people did use that. And now we have this, recent breakouts. And so when we're running into people who have already used that leave, unfortunately. So, you know, they're, you know, if they don't have any sick leave, you know, of course they're having to do leave without pay. And another comment I wanted to make was in regards to, we have had our local clinic here. I know that there has been some religious denials, and unfortunately, you know, it affects our ability to, I guess, serve the public, you know, in our clinic, because we have these people that leave. We're short-staffed already, and now we're having these people leave. So it's kind of it's a real tough one as far as, you know, just I don't know as far as and I don't know what that policy looks like. I haven't seen their policy for the religious, what the requirements are, but it's just a tough situation all around. I mean, with COVID and dealing with all these, and we have so many unique situations with each employee in their situation that they're in. It's just kind of, we handle it case by case. And there's really no set, you know, I guess how it's handled. They're all unique. So that was my comments.
If I may, Janet, I want to make build on one thing that Dorothy said, which I think is Dorothy's comment is really important. Our policies can evolve. And the question that I've had when I've been in the room on these conversations is, are you evolving because it's more convenient, or are you evolving based on some kind of medical or legal standard? So let me give you an example of that. Working with a tribe and the number of people that they let into the casino, at one point it was 50% of the maximum occupancy. And the casino wanted to make it 75%. And when they wanted to move from 50% to 75%, i.e. increase the number of patrons coming into the casino, I asked them why. And they said, because our competitor down the road is doing that. And my devil's advocate argument back was, that's not a legitimate reason. Competition's not enough. What's the medical basis for going from 50% to 75%? And as you know, as a lawyer, I'm not a decision maker, but I was able to nudge back and offer my respectful recommendation to look at that again. And at the next meeting, they came back with not only a business reason to do it, but also a medical justification. And at that point, I was much more comfortable in endorsing that from a legal perspective. So Dorothy, thank you for that.
Rick, we have a couple of more really good questions here. Eric Angulo has asked a question. Is there any liability to a tribe if there are adverse reactions experienced by the employee upon taking the vaccine for a mandate?
Eric, that is the $100 question. And if we had an award to give today, it would go to you, because this is a really hard question. And you're gonna hear me wrestle with this a little bit. So the legal analysis is no, there is no liability, because the liability falls to Moderna and to Pfizer and to AstraZeneca, the companies that are producing these vaccines. That's where the liability lies. And there is federal law that gives a certain level of protection to vaccine manufacturers that really protect them from liability, from legal risk. What makes this question hard is there are hundreds of lawsuits now over this. And employers have been sued over this. I'm not sure if it's specifically to a mandated vaccine, and we will continue to monitor those lawsuits, whether that's a factor or not. But there have been some lawsuits where employers have encouraged employees to be vaccinated. They have been vaccinated and they got sick. So where those lawsuits go, I don't know where that's going to go. It's still working its way through the system. So I have to amend my answer a little bit. And when I amend my answer to no, there is no liability, it's less than clear. It's less than clear to me, and I know it's less than clear to you in hearing that answer.
Okay. I have one more question, if I may, regarding the confidentiality discussion. When is there a reasonable knowledge to know when you send out notifications regarding a confirmed case at your company? You know, there are certain aspects that need to be completed, such as deep cleanings, the sanitizing of an area, and at times when you send out this notification notifying people, okay, we got a confirmed case, and you notify the individuals who were affected, but you also got to dig in a little bit deeper and say, okay, well, what shift did this person work? Who were they in contact with? All the contact tracing. How is confidentiality viewed upon those situations?
Judy, I really like that question, and thank you for that. So a couple answers here, and I think Judy answered part of the answer to her question was in the question, which is how you react should be based again on science. And to the extent that there is someone that raises their hand and says that they are sick, and there's been a confirmed case of COVID, we want to take some steps to make sure that we are cleaning those areas to whatever science tells us to clean those areas. As interesting is kind of the secondary question that Judy raises, which is what do we communicate to our employees? And I think there are two paths here. Number one, and the path I like best, which is when the employee consents to us communicating to the other employees, so we ask Shirley, can we tell everybody else that you have COVID? And she says, yes, you can. I want to make sure my colleagues are protected. Will you sign this form that gives us permission to send an email out to everyone saying that on Friday you were diagnosed with COVID? Absolutely. So consent oftentimes, not always, but consent oftentimes is magic in the law. And to the extent that an employee consents in writing to communicating the fact that they have had, they've been diagnosed with COVID, I think is a really safe path for the employer. Obviously, we're not pressuring Shirley to do that, but we're giving her that option. I have those forms if you're interested in that. So where an employee either declines or accepts or consents, if you will, to having that communication. If Shirley does not consent, what do we do then? Well, we give the best information we can. So if we have a tribal administration office of 90 people, we can simply communicate in an email that as of Friday, one of our employees had COVID. And if you were here at work, in this last week, do with that what you think you need to do to protect yourself, whatever that is. If there's only one person in the enrollment office, you can't identify the enrollment office. I've seen some emails where there's been a communication, someone in human resources, there are 7 people in human resources, someone in human resources has COVID as of last Friday. We're not given their name, but if you came into the HR office last week, take some steps to protect yourself. So I think it's a circumstance by circumstance thing, but to the extent that your policy allows employees to consent to the publication of their name, that is something that some employees want. They want to help protect their colleagues, and that they will do. And if they don't, let's do the best we can at communicating what we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Are there any other questions?
Janet, there's one in the chat box from Morgana Burrows.
Morgana, how do you prevent COVID rumors when a team member goes out on leave?
Janet, I missed one word in that question. How do you prevent? I missed the next word.
COVID rumors when a team member goes out on leave.
So Morgana, that's a really, really good question. And as your legal professional, it's a little bit above my pay grade, because this is what you human resources folks get the big bucks for, right? In dealing with the more difficult questions. Rick can read the law and tell you what the law says. That's a easier task. But dealing with rumors and gossip outside of COVID is hard. But it's even more difficult now. And I think part of this is what I would call the script, in helping our directors and managers know that during these uncertain times, we need to be focused on our important work. And to the extent that there are medical concerns, that we want to be respectful of our colleagues. And whether that is an operation for a bad back or COVID, we still want to be respectful. But I'd be curious to hear what Morgana has to say about this, or any other of our HR professionals online today, to see if there's a better answer than the one that I provided.
Rick, unfortunately, I don't have a better answer. I think, like you said, it's just trying to get ahead of the gossip. We have a very large company, and one person goes out and everybody panics. It says, oh my gosh, they must have COVID. Well, that may not be the case. So it's pulling those people aside and saying professionally, you know, like you said, things are covered under HIPAA privacy. Please make sure you're respectful in the workplace and don't gossip and spread rumors. That's about all we can do.
Morgana, really well said.
All I would add briefly, Tal, here is it's a good time to revisit policy. As you said, Rick, policy should always evolve, and this is one to pivot to, and also a good time to revisit confidentiality statements and acknowledgement.
Yes.
I find some of our organizations have been very lax in that area, and then try to comply with it with no documentation. Get back to that HR profound statement, document. But that's all I have to add on to that one. I think we need to do a better job in our confidentiality acknowledgements.
If I could add to that, also, Tal, is, you know, not only review your policies to make sure that your policies are up to date into, you know, in a situation of, you know, current activities, but also for those individuals who are working with a compact, like California has, you know, all their gaming compacts. Make sure that you read your compact and understand what you're held to and what you're not held to. You know, the question of does OSHA apply, or does, you know, or does it not? You know, there's a conversation on, well, our compact says we do, but our compact, or most compacts, I'm going to say, because there may be some out there, really speak to a company needs to adopt and comply with standards no less stringent than those put on by OSHA. So read your compact to make sure you understand what the compact specifically says.
Great point, Judy. Yeah, thanks for the build on. Thanks.
I have one more from Ellen. For clarification, if HR has information regarding COVID cases, employees need to sign a waiver to release their information outside of HR.
So really good clarification, and thanks for the opportunity to address that. So to the extent that I go to the workforce, either verbally or in an email or other communication, and I use somebody's name, Shirley has COVID, has been diagnosed with COVID or any other medical condition, I want to make sure I have her written consent. However, we're going to balance that against kind of the need to know doctrine. To the extent that Shirley has COVID, she's been diagnosed last Friday, and she won't consent in writing, I still need to communicate with my colleagues. So I'm going to communicate that someone within this 90-person tribal administration building had COVID last Friday. And Shirley might say, well, everybody knows that's me. Well, no, I didn't say it's you. But I have to communicate. I got to protect my colleagues by saying someone has had it. And then to the extent, this is a little bit of a judgment call, if there are multiple people in one department and we can't identify who has COVID in that department, I use the example of the 7-person HR team. I'm not saying that Shirley happens to be in HR. I'm not using Shirley's name, but someone in HR has been diagnosed with COVID in the last 7 days. Protect yourself, employees. So I think that's a better approach, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of revisit that topic, and hope that was responsive.
And I have a Christy Parker. You just mentioned HIPAA. An employee reporting their exposure positive case to their manager, risk and safety HR, need to know group, and this info is shared within this need to know group, would not be a violation of HIPAA since the info wasn't provided by a medical facility, and we are not a medical facility. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there's a fair amount of misunderstanding about HIPAA. So when it comes to our healthcare clinic or an IHS clinic, HIPAA absolutely applies. There are regulations that say so, and under funding agreements, HIPAA applies, so no doubt about that. On the employer side, when it comes to confidentiality, there's a good chance that HIPAA might not apply to the communication of medical information. So now we're going to focus on our own policies, our own laws as tribal sovereigns. And then the FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, has what I call a miniature HIPAA privacy confidentiality provision in it. So at the end of the day, we're going to be respectful of confidentiality, but our colleague is right that HIPAA might not be the controlling law that impacts our analysis when it comes to the employer communicating among itself as the hypothetical, where the compliance officer is talking to the good folks in human resources.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick. It is 10 o'clock and we know everyone's time is very valuable. I want to thank you, Rick, for your knowledge and your time. Today I've learned a lot, and I wanted to open it up to Judy and Tal, if you have any words.
I just really want to say thank you, Rick. A great session, a lot of great questions and answers, and thank you everyone for participating and feeling so comfortable to be able to ask the questions you want to ask, and whether they're live or in the chat box. We appreciate all your support, and we will, and I guess this is before I say we will do it. There was a question for the form, consent form, Rick, and there's also a question on whether this presentation will be posted on our website. So if we can answer that for our members, that would be great.
As to the posting, I understand that it will be by Friday, building on Janet's good comments from earlier. And then as far as that form is concerned, at my website, there's about 80 articles, not on this, but about 80 articles. And there's an article on this topic on my website, richardmcgeelaw.com. The form is baked into that article as well, or send me an email. If you send me an email, I will get that article and those forms in your hands. Grateful.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, Judy and Janet, just real quick build on, and I'm taking a bold statement here as Judy did in another direction, in that I'm going to volunteer Mr. McGee for a follow-up. I counted at the height of people coming in and out of the room, we've had as many as 60 total people involved in this conversation. So I know that there's a lot of interest, there's more questions and some follow-ups. So I know we have monthly coffees with Nahara, but maybe we set an additional one in play over the next few weeks and have some follow-ups, and others can join us for a recap, but then keep this group going. And I think it's a good critical group to share resources. So Rick, thanks. Judy and Janet, thank you, and the board members, appreciate it. And all the members and friends of Nahara, great to see your names and faces today. April, Hawaii, get registered. Hawaii, April, register. Join us now. If you can't go to Hawaii, San Antonio, get your boots ready for September. Come to both. There's my sales pitch. Love y'all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you very much. Grateful.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
It's like a game of Tetris, people leaving the room.
This conference will now be recorded.
Bye, Mike.